No. That ache in your chest is not as noble as you think it is. You keep calling it love because that sounds cleaner, holier, less humiliating. But what you are really mourning is stranger than that, sadder than that, more embarrassing than that. You are not standing in the ruins of a person. You are standing in the ruins of a story you built with your own starving hands. That is why it hurts in such a distorted way. Not because they were extraordinary, not because they were irreplaceable, not because heaven carved their name into your bones. No. It hurts because your mind took fragments, little crumbs, half smiles, half promises, a few warm nights, a few careful words, a little attention when you were lonely, and from those scraps, you built a cathedral. You hung stained glass where there were only windows. You called convenience devotion. You called emotional dependency destiny. You called inconsistency depth because you did not want to admit you were kneeling in front of confusion, begging it to become clarity. And now that the performance is over, you sit there shaking, whispering their name, when the truth is that what you miss most never fully existed. You miss who they seemed to be when your hope was doing most of the work. You miss the version of them that arrived only in flashes, only when it benefited them, only when your silence, your tenderness, your loyalty, your patience made them feel large. And your heart, poor thing, does not know how to grieve illusions without feeling foolish. So it keeps calling the illusion by their name. You think you miss their voice, but listen carefully to your own memory and you will hear something else hiding underneath it. What you miss is the ritual, the tiny ceremony of checking your phone, the quick rise in your chest when their name appeared, the private theater of anticipation. It is not always the person that leaves you trembling. Sometimes it is the routine they trained into your nervous system. Morning messages, late night confessions, those little questions that made you feel chosen for 5 minutes. The fake tenderness of, "Did you eat?" from somebody who could not even protect your peace for 1 honest week. People become addicted to patterns and then swear they are in love with souls. A man misses the woman who listened to him during his hardest month, but what he really misses is the feeling of being seen when he was invisible to everyone else. A woman cries over the one who understood her, but what she truly misses is the private relief of not having to explain every wound for a little while. A son misses a father who praised him once in a blue moon, not because that father was deeply present, but because the child inside him still kneels for approval, like a beggar waiting for a rare coin. The routine becomes sacred because the wound is old. And once your body ties relief to a face, it begins lying to you. It tells you that the source of relief must be precious, must be rare, must be meant for you. But relief is not proof of love. Being soothed is not the same as being safe. Being wanted in moments is not the same as being cherished in truth. This is why people crawl back to what hurt them. Not always because the person was magnificent. Sometimes because the body remembers the schedule of comfort and panics when the medicine stops. And you keep romanticizing the hand that fed you crumbs because your hunger made every crumb feel like a feast. Let me tell you something uglier. Sometimes you did not even fall for them. You fell for what your own mind projected onto them. That one lands badly, doesn't it? Because it means part of this heartbreak belongs to your imagination. It means you were not merely deceived, you collaborated. You saw a little softness and painted a whole character around it. You heard one honest sentence and treated it like evidence of a beautiful inner world. They sat beside you when you were breaking, and suddenly in your head, they became loyal, deep, safe, rare, misunderstood, special. All because your exhausted heart wanted somewhere to rest. You know how this happens in ordinary life? A coworker defends you once in a meeting, and your mind starts writing poetry about integrity. A distant relative remembers your birthday one year, and you suddenly imagine hidden affection that was never consistently there. A person speaks gently after months of coldness, and your heart rushes to crown them merciful, instead of asking why gentleness only arrived after distance, guilt, or fear of losing access. Hungry people become excellent fiction writers. Lonely people become architects of false depth. The neglected become brilliant at turning tiny gestures into proof of grand meaning, because grand meaning is easier to bear than random emptiness. You were not stupid. No. You were aching. There is a difference. But pain can still make a fool of perception. And once the illusion hardens, every new contradiction gets explained away. They're just stressed. They're scared. They've been through a lot. They don't know how to love. Maybe. But pain in their past is not purity in their intention. And damage in their history does not magically make your suffering a duty. At some point, the honest question is not whether they had reasons. The honest question is whether the person you kept defending ever truly existed outside the shelter of your explanations. And if the answer shakes you, good. Truth is supposed to shake loose the lies you were using as blankets. The cruelest delusions are not built from constant affection. They are built from inconsistency. Yes, that unstable rhythm you called chemistry, intensity, connection, mystery. People talk about heartbreak as if it is always born from great love, but so often it is born from unstable reward. Warm today, cold tomorrow. Available when you pull away, distant when you lean in, tender when you are about to leave, absent when you begin to trust. That pattern can make the human mind kneel. It turns ordinary attachment into obsession, because the soul starts chasing the return of a feeling it was never allowed to keep. A husband who rarely praises his wife, but suddenly becomes soft after she stops trying, can trap her in decades of emotional gambling. A woman who disappears for days and returns with tears and apologies can make a man bond not to peace, but to the relief that follows chaos. A friend who humiliates you in jokes, then later pulls you aside and says, "You know I love you," creates confusion so sticky it starts imitating intimacy. And then you sit there telling yourself, "No one ever made me feel like this." Of course not. Stable people do not make you feel like emotional withdrawal and emotional rescue in the same hour. Stable people do not train your nervous system to confuse unpredictability with depth. You did not miss a calm home. You missed the rush before the door opened. You missed the trembling before the message came. You missed the possibility that maybe this time, the version of them you wanted would stay a little longer. That is why losing them can feel like losing oxygen. Not because they were oxygen, no. Because they kept teaching your body to panic first and breathe later. And once panic and relief come from the same person, the bond becomes chemical in a very human way. The mind starts calling the pain meaningful because admitting it was manipulation, neglect, fear, or selfishness would force you to grieve not only them, but your own willingness to stay. That is the part people avoid. It is easier to say, "I miss you," than to say, "I became addicted to hoping you would become who I needed." But one sentence keeps you asleep, and the other begins to wake you up. There is another reason the illusion survives so long. Public versions of people interfere with private truth. You saw how they laughed with others, how gentle they sounded in front of family, how charming they were around strangers, how generous they looked in rooms where being watched mattered. A beautiful trap. Because now your pain has competition. Now every cold, private moment is forced to stand beside their public warmth, and your mind starts doubting its own bruises. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I caught them on bad days. Maybe the problem is me. That split destroys people. A man comes home to indifference from the same wife who glows in public gatherings and posts polished affection where everyone can see it. A daughter receives silence from the same mother who is praised by neighbors as patient, smiling, deeply caring. An employee is quietly undermined by the same manager who gives speeches about teamwork, kindness, and respect. The performance confuses the victim because cruelty becomes harder to name when it hides behind social grace. And then the memory of leaving them feels wrong, almost sinful, because how could someone so admired, so polished, so publicly gentle be the source of your private emptiness? Maybe because some people do not need to be evil in a dramatic way to damage you. They only need to reserve their worst selfishness for places where witnesses are absent. They only need to give you just enough tenderness to make your accusations sound unbelievable. That is why you keep missing the illusion. The illusion is socially supported. It has witnesses. It has pictures. It has old messages and soft tones and selective memories. The truth, meanwhile, often lived in pauses, in the room after the guests left, in the look on their face when you needed something inconvenient, in the sudden exhaustion that filled the air whenever your pain became the subject. And because pain without witnesses feels unreal, you went back to the prettier story. Stop doing that. Stop asking the crowd who they were. The crowd met the edited version. You met the cost. And the cost is often the clearest biography a person will ever write. Nostalgia is not a historian. It is a forger. It takes evidence, trims the edges, wipes off the blood, softens the lighting, and hands your lonely heart a counterfeit memory so convincing you almost bow to it. You remember the way they looked at you during one honest evening, but you conveniently forget the week of silence that came after. You replay the softness in their apology, but the body somehow forgets how many times you had to drag honesty out of them like a bucket from a dry well. You miss the nights of laughter and edit out the humiliation, the waiting, the second guessing, the small ways you had to reduce yourself just to keep peace. This is why grief gets so theatrical inside the mind. It does not show the whole film. It shows selected scenes. It keeps the music and removes the aftermath. A man who leaves a toxic circle of friends remembers the jokes, the road trips, the noise, the belonging, but not the mockery that disguised itself as brotherhood, or the way his secrets stopped feeling safe the moment entertainment needed a victim. A woman misses the tenderness of a man who once held her while she cried, but memory politely forgets how quickly he turned cold when her sorrow lasted longer than his patience. A child grown into adulthood remembers the rare, gentle day with a distant parent and turns it into proof of deep love, while years of emotional absence get filed away as they did their best. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But your loneliness is not allowed to rewrite the record simply because the truth is hard to bear. And here is the darkest part. The worse your present emptiness feels, the more beautiful your past illusion becomes. Because the heart under pressure becomes a dishonest editor. It starts using yesterday as pain medication. It wasn't that bad. They did care. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I ruined it. Look how quickly suffering volunteers to accuse itself if it thinks self-blame might reopen the door. But truth does not change because you are lonely tonight. A pattern remains a pattern. Neglect remains neglect. Selective affection remains selective affection. The illusion gains its power from your refusal to review the whole file. So review it, all of it. The delays, the excuses, the public charm and private exhaustion, the promises made when you were halfway out the door, the tenderness that arrived only when they sensed loss. Your heart may want a poem, but your healing needs a transcript. And transcripts are merciless. Good. Mercy is not pretending the knife was a flower. Loneliness is one of the most elegant liars in human life, because it does not always tell you, go back to what harmed you. No, it says something softer, more humiliating, more convincing. It says, at least that pain was familiar. And people, good people, weary people, patient people, people who are trying not to fall apart, people listen. They listen because emptiness is loud. A quiet room after a bad relationship can feel louder than the relationship itself. An empty chair at dinner can suddenly make you romanticize the person who used to sit there and criticize your tone, your timing, your laugh, your sensitivity. A phone that no longer lights up can make you miss someone whose messages mostly delivered confusion, guilt, mixed signals, and little emotional taxes disguised as intimacy. That is how absence steals clarity. It is not always proving their value. Sometimes it is only amplifying the silence they left behind. A man misses the wife who exhausted him because the house now sounds like consequence. A daughter misses the parent who withheld tenderness because even cold attention can feel preferable to clean abandonment. An employee misses the manipulative boss who kept them off balance because uncertainty became a strange form of structure, a sick schedule the body learned to recognize. People return to unhealthy bonds for the same reason some people keep touching old bruises. Pain that is known can feel safer than uncertainty that is not. You think you miss them because your chest tightens at night, because your appetite slips, because music starts sounding like memory, because your body becomes a museum of little reactions. But bodies are not philosophers. They do not always know the moral meaning of what they are attached to. They know repetition. They know withdrawal. They know the schedule of voices, footsteps, tones, arguments, reconciliations. So when the source disappears, the system protests. The protest feels like longing. The longing gets misnamed love. What a tragic little chain. You say, I miss the way they checked on me. But did they check on you? Or did they check whether access still existed? You say, I miss the comfort. Was it comfort? Or was it the short-lived peace that followed emotional chaos? You say, no one gets me like they did. Did they get you? Or did they learn enough about your wounds to keep the door unlocked? Ask harder questions. Real comfort does not leave you chronically confused. Real care does not require you to betray your own perception just to keep it. Real affection does not keep changing temperature depending on your usefulness, your obedience, or your willingness to remain small. And loneliness, loneliness, will beg you to negotiate with these truths. It will say, maybe you can just take the good parts. But human beings are not buffets. You do not separate selective tenderness from the system that made it selective. You do not keep the warm smile and throw away the manipulation that powered it. You do not keep the validation and erase the conditions attached to it. This is where many people betray themselves, not in dramatic ways, quietly, respectably. They reopen the door not because wisdom failed, but because silence felt unbearable. They answer the late message because their room was too quiet. They call back because memory has a prettier face at 2 a.m. They forgive too early because the thought of starting over with emptiness feels heavier than carrying the same old wound another month. And that is where illusion fattens itself. Inside the hours where solitude starts sounding like punishment. But solitude is not always punishment. Sometimes it is detox. Sometimes the shaking, the restlessness, the urge to return, the need to reread old messages, the way your chest tightens when you almost block and then stop. Sometimes that is not evidence that you lost something precious. Sometimes it is evidence that your system is trying to unlearn dependence on emotional instability. Which is uglier, yes, because now you must admit that what you called missing them may partly be your body missing its familiar poison. Do not worship a reaction just because it is intense. Intensity is not always truth. Sometimes it is only withdrawal wearing perfume. There is another layer beneath all this, and it is cruel because it makes you blush when you finally see it. You do not only miss the illusion they gave you, sometimes you miss the illusion they gave you about yourself. Who were you in that story? Look at that carefully. Were you the one finally chosen? The one finally desired? The one finally understood? The one whose loyalty, patience, sacrifice, softness, intelligence, or endurance would at last be seen and rewarded? Ah, there it is. You are not just grieving a person, you are grieving an identity that felt possible around them. A better version of you, a more lovable version, a more important version. A version that did not have to carry the old fear that you are forgettable, too much, not enough, easy to leave, difficult to keep. That is why some separations wound the ego like an exposed nerve. The person leaves, yes, but they also take the mirror in which you looked more whole than usual. A quiet man misses the woman who used to call him brilliant, and suddenly, without her attention, he feels ordinary again. A patient woman misses the troubled man she kept rescuing, because without him, she is forced to ask whether she was loving or merely needed to be needed. A child misses the emotionally distant parent, not because the parent was deeply nurturing, but because that child still imagines one final moment of approval could repair the entire architecture of inadequacy. You see how merciless this gets? You are not only facing their absence, you are facing the collapse of a fantasy in which your wounds finally made sense. In that fantasy, all your patience would pay off, all your understanding would be recognized, all your staying would be honored. One day they would become soft and honest and stable, and your loyalty would transform from private suffering into proof that you were special enough to be the exception. But sometimes there is no grand reward waiting at the end of your endurance. Sometimes endurance is simply endurance, and the one you were enduring for was never writing the same redemption story. That hurts because it strips nobility from suffering you invested in. It means your tears were real, your hope was real, your sacrifice was real, but the future you attach them to may have been fiction. And fiction can be harder to bury than facts. Facts are concrete. They can be named. They lied. They withdrew. They used warmth selectively. They kept me uncertain. Fine. But fiction? Fiction haunts. Maybe they could have changed. Maybe if timing were different. Maybe if I were calmer, stronger, prettier, richer, less wounded, more patient. No, stop. Stop turning yourself into the missing ingredient in somebody else's unfinished character. Their inability to love cleanly is not automatically evidence that you lacked the correct shape. Their inconsistency is not proof that your devotion needed a better performance. Their confusion is not your exam. Yet the ego loves that interpretation because it preserves hope. If the problem was you, then maybe improvement can bring the illusion back. Lose weight, become colder, heal faster, speak less, need less, chase less, give more. What a humiliating prison. You start remodeling yourself around the ghost of someone who was never stable enough to deserve architectural influence over your soul. But once you see that, really see it, something sobering happens. You realize the grief is not merely romantic, it is existential. You are mourning an entire imagined future in which being loved by them would finally settle the argument inside you. It was never going to settle. No broken mirror can tell you the truth about your face. Let us go even deeper into the shame nobody likes to confess. Sometimes what you call missing them is actually wounded pride screaming in a dark room, not because you adored them so purely, but because being left, replaced, forgotten, downgraded, or emotionally outgrown bruised something primitive in you. The ego hates unfinished business. It hates not being chosen after investing so much. It hates seeing somebody who confused you move on with casual shoulders, clean sleep, and appetite intact, while you sit there replaying old scenes like a detective assigned to your own humiliation. And that is when illusion becomes seductive again. Not because your spirit knows they were right for you, but because your pride cannot bear the possibility that you mattered less to them than they mattered to you. Look how quickly heartbreak becomes a courtroom. How dare they? After everything? After all I gave? After what I tolerated? Those questions feel righteous, but inside them there is often a bruised vanity begging to be restored. A man says he misses her, but secretly he misses the certainty that he had a place in her world. A woman says she cannot forget him, but sometimes she cannot accept that the man who once pursued her now acts like her absence is weather. A friend cannot stop thinking about the one who betrayed him, not because the bond was holy, but because disloyalty shattered his image of his own importance. That does not make you shallow, it makes you human. But if you do not tell the truth about the ego will disguise itself as sacred grief and keep you kneeling long after the bond has revealed its poverty. This is why people stalk, reread, compare, imagine, rehearse speeches they will never send, fantasize about being seen winning, glowing, healed, desired by others. They are not always seeking reunion. Sometimes they are seeking revenge without violence, vindication without contact, proof that the one who harmed them was blind. But even that can become another chain. Because now your healing depends on the offender noticing it, and dependence does not become freedom just because it wears sharper clothes. Do you hear me? It is not liberation if you still need the audience that bruised you to applaud your recovery. Calm down, calm down. I know, that lands hard. You wanted to become unforgettable so the illusion of their powerlessness over you could soothe the insult. You wanted them to regret. You wanted them to see what they lost. You wanted the story rewritten in your favor. Human, painfully human. But there is a cleaner truth available if you can stomach it. Some people will never measure your value accurately because accuracy was never their business. Their choices came from appetite, fear, selfishness, confusion, immaturity, status anxiety, emotional laziness, cowardice, take your pick. Your worth did not become smaller because their perception was shallow. And yet the mind, offended and bleeding, keeps wanting a better verdict from the same judge who misread the case from the beginning. That is how illusion steals months, years, entire seasons of life. You keep trying to win an argument in a courtroom that never had moral standards. So the work is uglier than move on. The work is to endure being misunderstood without making your identity dependent on the correction. The work is to let an inaccurate witness stay inaccurate. The work is to accept that some chapters end without your dignity being publicly explained, and that Allah sees what the crowd does not. That last part matters, because if you seek your final justice only from human perception, you will become a slave to reaction. And reaction is a filthy god. Bow to truth, not applause. The body keeps records the tongue cannot summarize. You may say, I know they were bad for me, and still your hands shake when the phone vibrates. You may say, I know it was an illusion, and still your chest tightens at sunset because that was the hour they usually returned. Understanding is not always immediate obedience. This is where many people become cruel to themselves. They think insight should instantly erase attachment, and when it does not, they panic and assume the bond must have been profound. No. Sometimes your body is simply late to the meeting your mind already attended. It learned them through repetition, tone, smell, tempo, silence, the speed of footsteps in a hallway, the exact pause before a message, the way your stomach clenched right before they were warm again. It learned all of that like weather. So when the weather changes, the body does not say, wonderful, truth has arrived. It says, where is the storm I memorized? A woman leaves a manipulative marriage and still reaches for her phone to send him updates he no longer deserves, because years taught her that selfhood required his reaction. A young man cuts off a friend group that mocked him under the name of love and still feels restless every weekend because his nervous system tied belonging to noise and disrespect. A daughter stops chasing an emotionally absent parent and then feels guilty every morning because her body was trained to call longing duty. These reactions are not always signs that you should return. Sometimes they are the tremors of detox. But detox is ugly because it lacks poetry. No one wants to admit, I still crave what wounded me because my system got used to surviving inside it. People prefer the more flattering line, it was unforgettable. Yes, being trapped in smoke is unforgettable too. That does not mean smoke is where lungs belong. So when memory hits your body like a thief, when your sleep becomes uneven, when old music tastes like weakness, when certain places pull your ribs inward, when your mind starts bargaining with old versions of reality, do not immediately call it love. Call it information. Call it residue. Call it the body emptying drawers you forgot were full. Sit with it without worshiping it. Observe it without building a shrine around it. There's the old panic. There is the old hunger. There is the old fantasy trying to put makeup on a wound. This is how maturity sounds when nobody is clapping. Not dramatic speeches, accurate naming. And accurate naming saves lives, not always from death, but from repetition, which can be its own slow burial. You do not need to despise yourself for flinching. You do not need to pretend you are above grief. But you do need to stop using your body's reaction as unquestioned evidence of a bond's righteousness. A chain can leave marks after it is removed. The marks are real. That does not make the chain holy. Learn the difference, or you will spend half your life kissing the scars of things that never deserved your neck. So what does waking up from the illusion actually require? Not performance. Not bitterness dressed as intelligence. Not going cold just because softness once got exploited. It requires a kind of sober mercy toward yourself that feels almost severe. You must tell the truth without theatrics. Yes, I was drawn in. Yes, I excused what should have warned me. Yes, my loneliness wrote extra beauty onto ordinary selfishness. Yes, my ego wanted to be the exception. Yes, I confused intensity with meaning. There. That is cleaner than self-hatred and more useful than denial. A man who admits he stayed because chaos made him feel necessary can finally stop romanticizing a woman who only reached for him when her own emptiness became unbearable. A woman who admits she kept chasing a distant man because his approval felt like childhood repair can finally stop calling her compulsion fate. A son who accepts that he wanted one final nod from a father who never learned tenderness can stop handing his adulthood to a closed door. Truth is not supposed to flatter you. It is supposed to free you. Then comes the harder part. Building standards stronger than longing. Standards that do not collapse because someone sounds wounded, looks lonely, remembers your favorite details, or cries at the right moment. Standards that ask, are they consistent? Do they bring peace without making me smaller? Can they handle boundaries without punishing me? Is their care stable when no audience is present? You cannot heal from illusion while still negotiating with the evidence that created it. Stop collecting tiny signs that support hope while ignoring the larger pattern that buried it. Stop calling scraps potential. Stop calling confusion depth. Stop calling your own exhaustion commitment. And do not turn this into revenge. Listen to me carefully there. The answer is not to become colder than what hurt you. The answer is not to humiliate, punish, manipulate back, or perform indifference like theater. That only turns pain into inheritance. Break the inheritance. Let the lesson sharpen your sight, not poison your nature. Remain moral, remain disciplined, remain impossible to bait into ugliness. Because there is a clean kind of strength the wounded rarely discover quickly. the ability to walk away without needing to become monstrous in order to feel protected. Strange, isn't it? The strongest exit is often the least dramatic one. Not a speech, not a final war, not a last attempt to make them understand. Just clarity, just distance. Just the quiet closing of a door that no longer deserves negotiation. It hurts, yes. It may hurt for longer than your pride finds acceptable. But pain that educates is gentler than pleasure that deceives. And one day you will thank Allah, not only for what was removed, but for what was exposed. Some losses are mercy in sharp clothing. So here you are, standing in the strange graveyard of almosts. Almost loved, almost chosen, almost understood, almost safe. And that almost has been eating you alive because it is easier to bury a corpse than to bury a possibility. A person can be mourned, an illusion lingers. It lingers in the versions of the future you rehearsed, in the conversations that never happened, in the apologies you hoped would finally sound real, in the tenderness you kept imagining would arrive if you just endured a little longer, explained a little better, needed a little less, forgave a little more. But the truth, the adult truth, the humiliating, purifying, rib-cracking truth, is that you do not miss them the way you keep saying you do. You miss the shelter your mind built around their fragments. You miss the hope that turns selective warmth into imagined loyalty. You miss the version of yourself that felt briefly worth choosing in their presence. You miss the ritual, the distraction, the possibility, the chemical rhythm, the unfinished sentence. And because those things were partly built by your own need, they are hard to release without feeling as though you are abandoning a piece of yourself. But hear me now. You are not abandoning yourself by letting the illusion die. You are retrieving yourself from the theater where you confused projection for prophecy. Let it hurt. Let it shake your sleep. Let it expose the desperate corners of your heart that wanted to turn inconsistency into destiny. Let it embarrass you into wisdom. There is no shame in having longed deeply. The shame would be in learning nothing from it. Do not go back merely because the night is quiet. Do not reopen what Allah allowed to close merely because your body still remembers the old noise. Do not kneel to memory when memory is editing the evidence. And do not make an idol out of what could not carry you. That matters. Some people were never your home. They were only the room where your unmet needs learned to echo. Some people were never your peace. They were only the interruption that kept you from hearing how lonely you already were. Some people were never your answer. They were only the question that forced your hidden wounds to speak. And once the wounds speak, you have a choice. Romanticize the one who triggered them, or finally tend to them with honesty. Tend to them quietly, without spectacle, without waiting for the offender to understand, without needing the crowd to validate what happened in private. Allah knows. Your record is not lost. Your pain is not invisible to the one who sees without witnesses. that should calm something inside you if you let it. Not because justice will always look dramatic on earth, but because truth does not become false just because it was hidden well. So bury the illusion properly, not with poetry that keeps it glowing, but with plain words. It was not what I said it was. I was attached to hope. I mistook intensity for value. I called the wound meaningful because I was afraid emptiness would tell me harder truths. Good. Speak like that. Speak like someone who is done offering incense to confusion. Speak like someone who finally understands that longing is not evidence, chemistry is not character, and absence is not proof of worth. You survived the fantasy. Now survive the clarity. Because clarity is colder at first, yes, but it does not lie to you. And in the end, that is what saves a soul. Not the illusion that once comforted it, but the truth that refuses to flatter it while it heals.